Good morning, everyone. This is Chris Martin with Heterodox Academy. I'm here today with Dr. April Kelly-Woessner. She has written a number of papers and book chapters on ideology in the academy, both about the ideology of professors and the ideology of college students, and the transfer of ideologies, whether it occurs or does not. She's the co-editor of a book called The Still Divided Academy, and she's probably best well known in terms of her work with Heterodox Academy for writing a post about how Marcuse influenced today's college students. So welcome to Heterodox Academy, April.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Sure. I'd like to begin by talking about the blog post you wrote. Could you talk a bit about how Marcuse ties into this larger phenomenon, who he was, and how he influenced the American Academy?
Yeah, and it's funny because I don't think students are reading Marcuse, right?
Okay.
But what we
Yeah.
see is that students are acting as if they had, right?
Okay.
So we see this idea that tolerance is not a universal value. And for 6 decades, we have treated intolerance as a social problem, right? So we started studying intolerance in the 1950s when Americans were very intolerant of communists. And all of the research since then has treated political intolerance as a problem. Well, Marcuse argues that we should be intolerant of people who are intolerant. So it's the tolerance paradox, right? That if you stomp out the voices that are causing the intolerance, that you will have a more tolerant society. And so I think that's what we're seeing on college campuses, this idea that we're not intolerant, but we're just not going to tolerate hate and what we view as intolerance.
Okay.
The problem with that, of course, is that who defines what is hateful, who defines who are the intolerant, what are the values that deserve to be stomped out in a society. And so it actually does lead to a great deal of political intolerance, which is what we're seeing on college campuses today.
Okay. So for those who are unfamiliar with him, how would you describe Marcuse's role in shaping mid-century American politics on the left?
And I'll admit I'm not a political theorist, so I don't go too much into that in my work, but I think you hear the same language echoed, right? This intolerance of intolerance. And so I think in the blog post, I used a quote from a student who wrote for the Harvard Crimson, and you could have been reading Marcuse, right? The idea that if we want a society, we're not going to support free speech anymore. If we want a society that's committed to equality, instead we are going to limit the speech of people that we think are undermining those values of equality. And I think you hear that in a lot of the arguments about what students are doing on campus when they're protesting speakers, when they're upset about professors. This idea that they are doing it for a greater good. And so we have this conflict of values. And I think Marcuse argues that the greater good requires us to be politically intolerant.
Okay. And when you wrote that blog post, it was based on a couple of empirical analyses of one data set, and that was about 2 years ago. Could you talk a bit about whether you've done more empirical analyses since then?
I have. In fact, there's a second and even a third blog post that I've written that I actually like a lot more. It hasn't gotten as much attention. But I think we can start looking at what is happening and starting as social scientists to diagnose the problem. And I think the evidence points to two kind of underlying causes as to why political intolerance is on the rise. First of all, it's notable that political intolerance is on the rise, because for many, many years when we studied political tolerance, the conclusion was that every generation was more tolerant than their parents. And so Samuel Stauffer and others wrote that America is just going to get more and more and more tolerant over time. And so that first blog post, the one that talks about Marcuse, also shows that trend has reversed for the first time since we've started studying it. And so I find that to be pretty important. Because it's a reversal of what we thought was happening. And so the question as to why America's youth today are less tolerant than their parents for the first time since we measured political tolerance, I think it is an important question that begs some empirical study. And so, go ahead.
I was going to say, which data sets have you used so far?
So political tolerance is easiest to track on the General Social Survey, the GSS. And the reason why is because that's what we've been using since the 1950s.
Right.
So if you want to look at things over time, it's really what you have to go with, even though some people argue it's not the most perfect measure of intolerance. There are debates about how we measure it. But I think no matter how you measure it, the trends kind of stay the same, right? The baseline might move up or down a little bit, depending on the measures you use, but we see these same trends. In fact, when I wrote that first blog post, it was before some of these campus stories had hit the news.
Right.
And I actually got a little pushback from people that were saying I was wrong, that the youth aren't intolerant, that that this is not happening.
Okay.
No one's saying that anymore, right? So
yeah. But going to the GSS, what was the question they used in the 1950s for that?
Well, the GSS is actually, they look at a number of groups. So the GSS used a fixed group definition of political tolerance. So they ask whether or not you would allow a number of groups that people find controversial to speak. And so then when we look at tolerance, it's a scale, it's a compilation of whether or not you would allow usually 5 or 6 groups to speak in public, to teach college, right? To teach a course in a college or university, and whether or not if people argued that their books should be withdrawn from a public library, if you would support that, right? So kind of a book banning measure. And so it's all 3 of those things for different groups. And what we were most intolerant towards in the 1950s was communists, right? So people wouldn't want communists teaching their children at the university. They wouldn't want communists speaking in their communities. Today, the 2 groups that trigger those reactions the most are on the left and right. So it's anybody that's racist, and that's defined by the GSS as somebody that argues for some sort of genetic superiority or intellectual superiority of races. So racists are least tolerated, and then radical Muslims.
Okay. So when did the radical Muslims question get added?
That's a good question. More recently. Okay. Yeah. And so when you track over time, it becomes more difficult because you have these different measures. What I've done is looked at more recent data, but just look at it across generations, right? And so for a long time, we thought tolerance was increasing because we weren't adding new measures to the questionnaire. And so what we found was that tolerance of communists was increasing. But a lot of studies that came out in the 1980s, 1990s argued we're not becoming more tolerant. It's just our dislike has shifted to new groups. And so that's why those new groups got added to the survey.
So have you done any kind of maybe even informal qualitative work on why this is going on, interviews with people?
Well, I've actually done some studies of college students on my own campus. I've done some other work. And I think there's 2 things that we can point to. And so the second blog post I wrote at Heterodox that talked about trade protectionism in the marketplace of ideas. Looks at this variable of whether or not you have confidence in your civic skills and your civic knowledge. And what we find is that correlates pretty strongly and is a good predictor, even with controls, of political tolerance. So if you think you know a lot relative to other people, if you think you can hold your own in a political conversation, you're more tolerant than people who are insecure about their civic knowledge. So I think the perception of these college student protesters is that they're, ideological radicals who have these strong opinions. And yet what the data shows is that wanting to shut down other voices actually reflects an insecurity in your ability to, defend your own. And so the decline in civic knowledge, I think, is a big factor in political intolerance. And so we've seen a decline in civic knowledge at K through 12, in part because of a new emphasis on science and technology and STEM skills, which I think is great. But it's come at the cost sometimes of the emphasis on civics and civic knowledge. And so you can pull up any number of Pew or Gallup surveys that look at people's civic knowledge, and you see young people really don't know some of the basics about the Constitution, about free expression. And so it could just be that they don't know that there are these protections. I think they also don't have the historical perspective on free speech to appreciate it, not as a tool to oppress, but as a tool of the oppressed. right? And so they don't understand how important the First Amendment was to things like the civil rights movement. And so I think then, that context is important when you're thinking about the importance of free speech and balancing that against protection of equal rights. So I would point to civic knowledge decline. College and universities aren't doing any better. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni did a review of core curriculums at the top, I think it's 1,000, might be more, colleges and universities. Only 18% require a course in American government or American history.
Okay.
So they don't have the civic skills to engage in conversation and hold their own and have the confidence that they can participate in a marketplace of ideas and come out the winner. Right? And so then you want to shut things down.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in India, so I went to high school there, and I came to America for college. So in high school in America, let's say 20 years ago or 30 years ago, what did the average student learn about the First Amendment in high school?
I think, that's a good question. I don't know, I can only base it on what I was learning in school. But I think what we're seeing is that the actual knowledge has declined. So when you look generationally and just ask basic questions, the kind of questions you would find on a U.S. citizenship test, Americans do really poorly on them, right? And they're doing worse and worse over time. We used to have standardized testing for civics, and that was taken off due to budget cuts, I think, in 2012. But the last time we did it in our high schools, the scores were dismal. So we had failing grades and said, oh, let's not bother anymore. We'll stop testing for that. And I think a lot of critique of K through 12 education is that we're more and more teaching to the tests. And so if we're testing in math and science and reading, that's where the emphasis is. I don't know what we're teaching in civics, but they take history courses, but I think the emphasis isn't as much on that. I used to do a little experiment with my college students when they came in to my American government class, and I would ask them how many had American government in high school, and almost all of their hands would go up. And I would ask a second question, which is, how many of you had courses that were taught by somebody whose primary role at your high school was as a coach? And about half the hands would stay up.
Wow. Okay.
Right? Yeah. So again, it seems to be just something that, okay, we have to teach this. Anybody can teach it. I'm not sure it's the content and the quality and even just the enthusiasm that used to be there.
Yeah. So when you teach college students, do you introduce that topic and talk to them about the importance of tolerance, and do you see any effects?
I do. And that's I teach a course on political psychology. And we covered a lot in political psychology. My students in my research methods course do surveys of our campus, and they often measure political tolerance on campus and do all sorts of fun research projects with that. One of them a couple years ago looked at political tolerance across disciplines. The highest political tolerance was among political scientists. Right?
Well, they appreciate the history of it.
So I don't know if that's my influence or other people's influence. What I think it is these are people that are used to talking politics and have that civic competence. Right. The lowest tolerance was among our education majors. So that's indicative to me of what's going on in K through 12. And I think in K through 12 there isn't an emphasis on free speech because there's more concern about anti-bullying. There's more concern about limiting speech to create welcoming environments. And I think that's an important goal, right? I'm not dismissing that as a goal, but I think we have to be very careful about how we're balancing that message so that people have some nuance and some context about when speech is okay and when it's not.
So have you, was there a certain point when you consciously decided to introduce a lesson plan about the history of political tolerance and its importance?
I think I've always done it in my political psychology course. It seems like a natural topic in a kind of introductory political psychology course. But when I started studying it more, then that section grew, right? The emphasis on that grew.
So when you teach it, how do you convey the importance of it? I mean, what do you tell your students?
Everything for me is research-based, right? So I want people to know what the evidence is and what the data is. And what we see in the literature going back 60 years is evidence that political intolerance is harmful to the democratic vitality of a society. So when political intolerance levels are high, everybody perceives that they have less freedom, including the groups that you aimed to protect with your kind of Marcuse intolerance perspective. And so everybody's participation declines when you have this politically intolerant kind of ethos. And so we have treated political intolerance as a huge problem for many, many, many years, mostly because I think it was associated with conservatives. And conservatives were seen as intolerant mostly for security reasons. So when they felt that there was some sort of security threat, intolerance grew. And so you saw this after 9/11 with people willing to suspend civil liberties and civil rights in order to secure, our borders and make the, fight against terrorism. And so for a long time, it was just, conservatives are intolerant. And liberals were the advocates of free speech. That has changed. And we have to be careful here because I don't think the evidence is that liberals are now more intolerant than conservatives, but they're now matching them, right? And so what you had is you used to have this segment of society, this liberal segment that were the defenders of free speech, and we've lost that. So what we have now is no one's defending free speech.
Well, one of the things that go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say one of the things that I've seen in psychology research is Ronnie Janoff Bullman's work on social justice versus social order as the foundations of liberal versus conservative thought. So for liberals, the social justice orientation is a kind of an extension of the personal moral orientation towards pursuing goals enthusiastically, whereas for conservatives, the social order orientation is a extension of the personal idea of pursuing goals cautiously. And so I would imagine that what you see now is for liberals, a certain set of issues around social justice are sacred, and for conservatives, a certain set of issues around social order, which includes protecting the country, things like security, are in fact the sacred issues. But you're also finding this umbrella effect, if I understand correctly. Is that correct?
How so? What do you mean by that?
Oh, I meant like in general, there's some like intolerance towards both the left and the right. I mean, perhaps the question about the radical Muslim preacher who preaches hate towards the U.S., that probably touches a nerve both for people concerned with social justice and concerned with social order. So that's what I meant by umbrella effect. You find both people on the left and right being intolerant towards certain people. Right,
and that's why I think the effects of intolerance are wider than most people believe. And it's not just that there's this umbrella effect, but intolerance just tends to be, if you're intolerant, there's a general level of intolerance. And so when you look at these measures of intolerance, the GSS asks about some liberal groups, it asks about some conservative groups, and most people would expect liberals are just intolerant of conservative groups and conservatives are just intolerant of liberal groups. But what you find is that those measures are actually positively correlated. So people that are intolerant towards one group are more likely to be intolerant towards all the other groups, liberal or conservative. And so I think one of the things that might be going on is this perception of, well, what's fair is fair, right? And so if this group is offensive to me and they can't speak, then maybe I acknowledge that this group that's offensive to you shouldn't be allowed to speak either. And so there's this general just lessening of freedom for everybody across the board, including the groups you want to protect. So yeah, if you're intolerant of racists, you're also more likely to be intolerant of the Muslims, right? It's positively correlated.
Right. Well, Muslim fundamentalists in particular.
Yes.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I want to talk a bit about some of your other research now. You found that students tend to sense what the professors' ideologies are, and they tend to sense that most professors are Democrats and most professors are liberal. But that doesn't seem to be turning students off from careers in academia per se. Have you been continuing research on that area? Does that still seem to hold true?
Yeah, I mean, there's a slight dip in that for conservatives, but what we found in the book chapter on why conservatives don't go into academia what we found is that this liberal conservative bias for academia starts way before they get to college. So among high school students, conservatives are far less likely to say they want to get a PhD than liberals are, right? And so there's, I think, a lot of complicated sociological explanations for that.
Right.
But we see ideological imbalances in lots of fields because what it is in that field appeals to a certain type of person, right? And so I think there's a lot of research that shows that ideology is connected to our personality traits, right? And so if you think about liberal personalities, they tend to be people that want freedom, that don't like authority and 9-to-5 jobs and structure. They're less structured. And when you ask academics why they went into academia, not having that structure and having that flexibility and varied routines and not having a boss tend to be pretty high on the list of reasons. And so that, I think, lines up with a more liberal personality type.
Okay. So in the past, let's say 10 years, have you seen any conservative students from political science go into academia and then stay in academia from your particular department?
I have.
Okay.
A number of them. But I think my department at Elizabethtown College is somewhat unique. We've had a very balanced mix of liberals, conservatives, and moderates since I've been there. And so the student body as well is about evenly divided, liberal, conservative. So I think it's a place where conservatives feel a bit more like they're part of the mix. And so we at least aren't doing anything to discourage them from going into academia. And that leads to, I think, the second thing that I think is going on that is leading to political intolerance on campuses, and that is the decline of viewpoint diversity. So when Samuel Stauffer wrote the first study on political tolerance in 1955, he found a strong effect of education. As you become more educated, you become more tolerant. And that effect still holds. It's still the case that more educated people are more tolerant than people that are not as educated. The effect of that might be declining. And the reason why the effect might be declining, as Stauffer said, the reason why education has this effect and the reason why education matters is that going to college and getting an education exposes you to viewpoint diversity. That's the point he makes, right? And so some of the other studies that some of our colleagues at Heterodox Academy have done show that viewpoint diversity at some colleges, especially in the Northeast, is declining. Right? So if that was the mechanism, if that was the causal link between education and tolerance, as intellectual diversity in higher education becomes more diminished, we're going to see political intolerance decline because the effect of education is going to lessen.
So do you feel like the students who go to Elizabethtown and then go on to do PhDs in political science or psychology seem to have an advantage because they have more knowledge of other viewpoints?
Yeah, except, I have to say that I think political science in general tends to be a more tolerant discipline than some of the other fields. And I think there's data on that. We have a slightly higher mix of conservatives than maybe psychology. We definitely have a higher mix of conservatives than sociology. And so I think in general, political science students, lots of places, are getting more exposure to political diversity and political arguments than students in some other fields. But I think it is important. I think it makes them, better scholars.
Right. I would agree. What about libertarians? Do you have any students who self-identify as libertarian?
Yes, our Young American for Liberties group is usually our most active political group on campus. So they're a strong politically active group. What I like about a small school like Elizabethtown College, where you have lots of different, where you have a mix of ideologies among your students, is they can't self-isolate. My college Democrat president sits beside my Young Americans for Liberties president in my research methods class, and they help each other on the SPSS labs. And so what we saw this last election cycle, as divisive as America is, our three political student groups had a joint voter registration drive.
Okay.
They had a joint event on election night. They were together watching those results come in.
That's
And
fascinating. Yeah.
you know, my college Republicans were comforting my
Good.
college Democrats that are, you
Okay.
know, beside
Yeah.
themselves watching the results come in.
All right. So what's the ratio of people in Young Americans for Liberty versus Young Republicans at your college? Are they about equally split in terms of membership?
Um, I think the college Republicans is still a little bit larger,
Uh-huh.
but what's funny is I have a number of students that are in both.
Okay.
So there's some
Okay.
crossover there.
Okay. Okay.
And each of our groups kind of waxes and wanes depending on election cycles or even who the student leaders are at the time and what types of activities they're planning.
Okay. And if you were to recommend a book or an article for professors outside your discipline, say people in psychology or sociology who are interested in teaching their students about the history of political tolerance in the U.S., either from a theory perspective or from a data perspective, what would you recommend?
Oh, that's a good question because it's hard to identify just one book.
Okay, well, let's say you had to recommend 2 or 3.
So I actually like Diana Mutz's work on hearing the other side. And looking at how even on our social networks we're self-isolating. I think understanding the human tendency to do that is extremely important. Of course I would recommend Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, looking at why people are divided by politics and religion. I think that's an important one. So those are 2 that come to mind. I have a long list. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And lastly, a lot of the discussions we've had are about college students, but your point is that youth in general, regardless of whether they get a college degree or not, seem to be less tolerant. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, and on average, the ones that aren't in college are less tolerant than the ones that are.
Okay.
So this isn't something that's just happening on college campuses. I think college campuses become kind of a spotlight for this.
Right.
And I actually, I wouldn't even say that college campuses are creating this, but I would argue that if we are serious about the mission of higher education, we have an obligation to counter it. This is the place where people are supposed to learn to listen to other people and to engage in ideas that are different than their own. So I think it is a broader social trend. I think you see it on social media.
Right.
I like studies where people are now more offended if their son or daughter marries somebody of a different party than of a different race or religion, right?
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
So I think it's infected our society broadly. It plays out on college campuses. I think sometimes we create conditions on college campuses that foster intolerance and allow it to kind of grow. We defend it. We defend it more than I think in other environments.
I mean, when it comes to social media, one thing I've recently noticed, I don't know why I didn't notice this earlier, is that even though Twitter and Facebook get a lot of press coverage, if you look at a site like Quora, which definitely has tens of thousands of users, you do find a lot of inter-party dialogue there and inter-ideology dialogue on Quora. I don't think it'll ever be as popular as Twitter because it's not a site where you just write a short sentence of 144 characters and throw it out there, but because you want to be upvoted there, you want to give a legitimate answer and not just be snarky. And I found that encouraging. Of course, it's a smaller site, so there's that.
Yeah,
I think people
and I would wonder about the people that are on that site, how they differ from the people on social media in general. You're probably getting a very select subgroup of people who want to engage in that type of dialogue and debate.
Right. Yeah, I mean, probably people who are a little higher in maybe cognitive complexity and want to learn more about the nuances. Yeah, I mean, Twitter is almost designed for you to throw barbs at other people because you have this 144 character limit.
Yeah, and there are studies of Twitter and who people follow that show they are ideological enclaves, right? So you tend to follow people who you agree with politically, and so then we get in these echo chambers where people aren't exposed to different ideas. They don't know how to handle different ideas, and if different ideas are offensive to us when we get to college, then our instinct is to shut them down and ban them.
I mean, one of the things I've seen the New York Times do, I think every Friday now, they have a collection of pointers to articles from the center, left, and right. I forget the exact title of the article they used, but it's a compilation of links to articles on the web. I think they started it just about a month and a half ago. I remember I retweeted it, and John Haidt retweeted a link to it recently as well. So that's encouraging too, I think.
It is encouraging, except also, I mean, it's hard to break out of our ideological silo, even when we read something from the other side, because the evidence from social psychology is when we read something we agree with, it's credible. When we read something we disagree with, we are much more critical of the methods and the argument, and we find flaws, and then we dismiss it. So just reading things, I think, is a start. But I think we owe it to college students to also make them aware of these kind of cognitive biases that we all have, right? And you're going to be more skeptical of something that you disagree with, and you're going to find flaws in it where you didn't treat an article you agreed with the same way. And students knowing that and knowing how to recognize their own limitations in terms of assessing arguments, I think is really important.
Okay. That's a good point, too. Well, I guess we do have this challenge of what to do with people who don't take college courses in political science. And of course, there always will be some. I mean, I didn't take any. I was fascinated by politics, so I read about it. And fortunately, I was in social psychology, which is connected closely to it. But there is that larger issue. Anyway, I think we'll wrap things up here. But thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Okay, appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks, Chris.